A woman steps onto a commuter train in Vienna. Her hair is blonde, designer sunglasses rest on her face, and she's pulling a compact wheeled suitcase behind her. She settles into a seat within the second-class carriage, crosses her legs, then opens up a magazine. On the opposite side of the aisle, there's a man in his 40s absorbed in reading an Arabic newspaper. He's dressed in a gray suit, has a leather briefcase at his side, and keeps glancing at his watch every couple of minutes. To everyone else on board, they appear to be complete strangers sharing an ordinary trip. What nobody realizes is that within the next 90 minutes, one of these two individuals will lose their life. The man goes by Khaled Masri, although this represents merely 1 out of 17 different identities he's adopted throughout the last 10 years. Within Hamas circles, they know him as Abu Fizzle, the financial operator who channels millions of dollars through shadow corporations across Cyprus, Turkey, and various Gulf states. For Mossad, his designation reads as Echo 7, a financial facilitator whose termination has received approval from the uppermost echelons of Israel's governmental structure. And for the woman positioned across from him, he represents the precise reason she's dedicated 3 full years to living beneath deep cover throughout Europe, anticipating this very instant. What her actual name might be doesn't hold significance any longer. She's inhabited so many different personas across such an extended time frame that her original identity feels more like a role she once performed in some distant past. On this particular day, she exists as Catherine Mueller, working as a marketing consultant out of Munich, making her way to Salzburg for a scheduled client meeting. The day before, she was Simone Leclerc, functioning as a French translator. During the previous month, her identity was Elena Novak, operating as a Czech journalist. These identities stack upon one another like successive pages within a book she can no longer manage to shut. Yet underneath all these various names and passports and meticulously fabricated biographical details, her true nature remains that of a Caesarea operative, belonging to Mossad's most distinguished group of assassins, and her pursuit of Khaled Masri has consumed the past 23 months. This represents the account of how intelligence organizations convert murder into something precise, how a solitary operative manages to exist for years as another person entirely, navigating invisibly throughout European cities while anticipating the instant to execute their mission. How someone can meet their end inside a packed train carriage without anyone taking notice until the moment has already passed. It exposes the mechanisms of contemporary assassination, where death makes its appearance wearing a friendly smile and holding a magazine, where violence becomes so carefully refined that it resembles anything except what it genuinely is. Grasping how Khaled met his end demands grasping who he was as a person and the reasons his elimination transformed into something necessary. His birth occurred in 1968 within the bureaucratic refugee camp located in Gaza, and Khaled's upbringing unfolded under occupation's shadow. His father earned his living as a laborer on Israeli construction projects, returning home each evening worn down and degraded. His mother had the responsibility of raising 6 children inside a concrete dwelling of 2 rooms that lacked running water. Throughout his childhood, Khaled absorbed the calculations required for survival. You kept track of Israeli patrol patterns, committed checkpoint timetables to memory, identified which soldiers would accept bribes, and recognized which ones actively searched for reasons to place you under arrest. His intelligence was exceptional, and he finished at the top of his class even though his schools featured broken windows and outdated textbooks from decades past. He acquired English language skills through listening to BBC radio transmissions on a transistor he'd smuggled in. Hebrew came to him by examining Israeli newspapers he discovered discarded outside military facilities. By the time he reached his teenage years, he'd already begun transporting messages for local resistance organizations, utilizing his youth and seeming innocence as protection. Israeli soldiers observed a thin young person carrying textbooks, never imagining the folded communications concealed within his shoes. The first intifada broke out when Khaled had reached 19 years of age. He witnessed his neighborhood erupt into confrontations and military suppressions, rocks thrown against armored vehicles, young people shot down in the streets, funeral processions that transformed into demonstrations that resulted in additional funerals. However, while others hurled stones and Molotov cocktails, Khaled understood something essential. Fury disconnected from strategy amounted to nothing more than performance. What the resistance required wasn't additional martyrs, but rather infrastructure, the unseen systems handling money and logistics capable of maintaining operations across years instead of merely weeks. He became part of Hamas in 1990, though not in the capacity of a combatant but instead as an accountant. His particular expertise involved transferring money across international boundaries without creating traces that could be tracked. He established networks built from shell corporations, charitable organizations that directed cash toward operational cells, import-export enterprises that smuggled weaponry alongside regular consumer products. He constructed systems with such compartmentalization that if one section became compromised, the remaining portions stayed secure. Within a span of 5 years, his role had become essential. The individual who ensured Hamas fighters received their salaries, acquired weapons, and had access to safe houses whenever these became necessary. Israeli intelligence initially marked him in 1995 after intercepted communications exposed unusual financial movements flowing through a sequence of companies holding registration in Cyprus. The sums involved were excessive for legitimate commercial activity, the routing overly intricate for straightforward business dealings. Analysts followed the money backward to Hamas operations throughout the West Bank and Gaza. And positioned at the network's center sat Khaled Masri, a name appearing across dozens of documents yet never showing up in photographs, never captured on surveillance recordings. He existed as a phantom who transferred money while producing no fingerprints. By the year 2000, Khaled had established himself in Damascus, functioning under the Syrian regime's protection, which provided hospitality to Hamas leadership as part of its broader regional approach. Operating from Damascus, he managed what intelligence organizations referred to as the finance network, a decentralized framework for transferring funds throughout the Middle East and into Europe. He brought in businessmen, banking professionals, and currency traders, connecting them through loyalty combined with the assurance of financial gain. This network stretched through Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and penetrated deep into Europe's heart: Vienna, Zurich, Frankfurt, cities featuring discrete banking structures and substantial expatriate populations where millions could be transferred with limited oversight. European security organizations started identifying irregularities, cash deposits materializing in accounts connected to recognized Hamas operatives, wire transfers routed through numerous jurisdictions to hide their source. Khaled orchestrated all of it while preserving the appearance of a legitimate business operator. For European authorities, his identity was that of a Syrian merchant conducting business in textiles and electronics. To Hamas field commanders stationed in Gaza and throughout the West Bank, he represented the invisible force, guaranteeing that operations never halted due to insufficient funding. However, Khaled committed an error in 2006 that would eventually claim his life. Intelligence intercepts exposed his participation in financing a suicide bombing attack in Jerusalem that resulted in the deaths of 11 Israeli civilians while wounding numerous others. The operation had received meticulous planning. The bomber had been recruited and received training in Gaza. The explosive materials were smuggled through tunnels beneath Sinai. Yet the financial resources that paid for everything had traveled through Khaled's network, traced through a chain of transactions that Israeli analysts pieced together across months of careful examination. For Mossad, this constituted confirmation. Khaled wasn't merely a financial facilitator. His involvement in terrorism was direct. Blood stained his hands. The choice to eliminate him received approval at Israel's governmental highest levels. The Prime Minister and Defense Minister together signed what Mossad designated as a red page, representing open authorization for assassination. This document included no expiration specification. It would continue as active until officially withdrawn or successfully carried out. Khaled Masri had now become a legitimate target, vulnerable to elimination in any location worldwide where operational circumstances allowed. Yet eliminating Khaled would present no simple task. His residence in Damascus kept him under Syrian protection, encircled by security services antagonistic toward Israeli operations. His travels were infrequent, and when movement became necessary, bodyguards accompanied him, and he employed multiple identities. He altered his routes, switched hotels without advance notice, steered clear of patterns that surveillance teams might leverage. His nature was cautious, disciplined, and profoundly paranoid, the variety of target demanding patience, substantial resources, and an operative prepared to invest years beneath deep cover, anticipating a solitary, vulnerable instant. That's the point where she entered the picture, the woman destined to become Catherine Mueller, Simone Leclerc, Elena Novak, along with a dozen additional identities. Her actual name was Rachel Tzur, though by the moment she boarded that train in Vienna, even she experienced difficulty recalling what existing as Rachel had felt like. She'd reached 32 years of age, her birth occurring in Tel Aviv to parents who had relocated from Argentina during the 1970s. Her father held a teaching position in mathematics at the university. Her mother maintained employment as a translator within the foreign ministry. Rachel's upbringing included speaking Hebrew, Spanish, and English, shifting effortlessly among languages and cultural contexts. This linguistic adaptability, combined with her European physical appearance, established her value to Israeli intelligence from early on. Mossad recruitment came at age 25, following the completion of mandatory military service within the intelligence corps. Recruiters identified her potential during standard psychological assessments, observing characteristics that rendered her appropriate for deep cover assignments. Elevated intelligence, emotional steadiness, comfort existing in solitude, and most critically, the capacity to maintain deception across extended durations without experiencing psychological collapse. She received an offer for a position in Caesarea, Mossad's elite unit holding responsibility for assassinations conducted abroad. Her acceptance came without any hesitation. The training process consumed 3 years. She acquired surveillance methodologies, weapons proficiency, escape procedures, and the psychological conditioning necessary to kill with professional detachment. However, the most rigorous training concentrated on identity construction, how to establish a legend, meaning a comprehensive false biography capable of withstanding examination, how to think as the person you were simulating, to internalize mannerisms and convictions until the performance became impossible to distinguish from reality, how to exist for years as another person without permitting the mask to slip even a single time. Her first deep cover assignment came in 2008. The mission involved embedding herself within European business circles where Hamas operatives transferred money and recruited sympathizers. She would transform into Katrine Mueller, a German marketing consultant who maintained frequent travel between Munich, Vienna, and Zurich. Mossad supplied her with a comprehensive identity package, falsified birth certificate, university transcripts, employment records, tax documentation, even a social media footprint constructed across months to generate the impression of a genuine person with an authentic life. She secured an apartment in Munich, built relationships with colleagues and neighbors, attended yoga classes, and participated in a book club. Her dating life existed occasionally, always preserving emotional separation, never permitting relationships to evolve into anything potentially compromising her cover. She inhabited the Catherine Mueller persona so thoroughly that friends subsequently characterized her as ordinary, pleasant, yet unremarkable. The type of individual who merges into daily life's background, which was precisely the objective, invisibility achieved through mundanity. Across 2 years, she accumulated intelligence regarding Hamas financial networks operating in Europe, identifying crucial participants and charting how money transferred between accounts. She developed relationships with bankers, accountants, and businessmen who enabled transactions, gradually establishing trust while transmitting reports back to Tel Aviv through encrypted communication channels. She never posed direct questions, never provided any suggestion that her interest extended beyond professional networking. She merely listened, observed, and retained information. Then during early 2010, surveillance identified Khaled Masri traveling throughout Europe. He had departed Damascus for the first occasion in years, making visits to Vienna and Zurich to conduct meetings with financiers managing Hamas accounts. His travel was solitary without his customary security escort, utilizing forged Austrian and Swiss passports. For Mossad, this represented the vulnerability they'd been anticipating. Khaled had grown overconfident, or perhaps desperate circumstances had compelled him toward risks he typically avoided. Regardless, the opportunity had materialized. Rachel received fresh orders via encrypted transmission. Her instructions were to relocate to Vienna, establish surveillance on Khaled, and await the moment when operational circumstances aligned for elimination. The mission's timeline remained open-ended. Completion could require weeks, months, or potentially years. Authorization existed to employ any method deemed necessary, though the death needed to seem natural or accidental, something that wouldn't immediately spark an international investigation or reveal Israeli participation. Her move to Vienna occurred in March 2010, requiring the abandonment of Catherine Mueller to become Simone Leclerc, a French translator serving international corporations. The identity transition demanded 3 weeks of preparation. Fresh documents, revised backstory, different apartment, new social network. She modified her hairstyling, altered her wardrobe, adopted French mannerisms and speech characteristics. Catherine Mueller vanished as thoroughly as if her existence had never occurred, another discarded identity within a collection expanding larger each year. Within Vienna, she joined identical professional associations that Khaled's financial contacts regularly attended. She participated in networking gatherings, business conferences, cocktail receptions held in hotel ballrooms where European businessmen discussed transactions over champagne. She understood Khaled wouldn't materialize at these functions directly. His caution was too substantial for that. However, his intermediaries did attend, and through monitoring them, she could follow his movements and recognize patterns. For 6 months, observation continued without action. She discovered that Khaled maintained a Vienna residence under the identity Tariq al-Hashimi, presenting himself as a Syrian merchant dealing in luxury merchandise. His travels were frequent, to Zurich, Munich, and occasionally Milan, consistently by train instead of aircraft to circumvent airport security screening. His accommodations were mid-range hotels, avoiding luxury establishments where surveillance might prove more intensive. He conducted meetings with his contacts in cafes and public parks, transacting business in open spaces where electronic surveillance proved less effective than enclosed environments. She captured his photographs from distances, committed his routines to memory, documented every individual he encountered. She relayed detailed reports to Tel Aviv where analysts constructed a comprehensive profile of his activities. Yet, she didn't approach him. Not at this stage. The operation demanded patience. Complete understanding of him was necessary before making her move, to anticipate his reactions and recognize the moment of maximum vulnerability. The breakthrough materialized in August 2010, when surveillance identified Khaled planning a journey from Vienna to Salzburg. Intelligence intercepts indicated his intention to meet with an Austrian banker managing accounts connected to Hamas operations in Gaza. The journey would transport him through Austrian countryside on a regional train, a 3-hour trip through small communities and rural territory. It presented the perfect opportunity: a contained environment, predictable timetable, minimal security presence, and numerous extraction locations. Mossad planners in Tel Aviv granted operational approval. Rachel would board the identical train, presenting as an ordinary passenger. She would carry the weapon concealed within items appearing completely innocent to security screening. During the journey, she would locate an opportunity to eliminate Khaled in a fashion appearing natural, then exit at an intermediate station before authorities could mount a response. The operation would proceed quickly, surgically, and without trace. The weapon represented an engineering masterpiece developed by Mossad's technical division following years of research. It comprised 2 components, each harmless independently yet lethal when combined. The first was a modified perfume atomizer containing a transparent liquid resembling ordinary fragrance. The second was a dermal patch, thin as paper, coated with a chemical compound that would absorb through skin contact. When these 2 substances mixed within the human bloodstream, they would initiate cardiac arrest within minutes, replicating a natural heart attack so precisely that only specialized forensic examination could identify the difference. Rachel obtained the weapon components 3 days before the operation. She practiced the application procedure repeatedly in a safe house located outside Vienna, rehearsing each movement until automaticity was achieved. The perfume would be dispersed onto a tissue or handkerchief, generating an aerosol that Khaled would inhale. The patch would contact his skin through seemingly coincidental contact, a momentary touch on the arm or shoulder, lasting under 1 second, yet delivering a fatal dose through the skin. The combination would overwhelm his cardiovascular system, arresting his heart while producing no obvious death cause beyond travel, stress, and pre-existing conditions that forensic examiners would presume without supporting evidence. On September 12, 2010, Rachel awakened in her Vienna apartment at 5:30 in the morning. She showered, dressed in business casual clothing, and packed a compact wheeled suitcase with garments and toiletries, reinforcing her cover as a marketing consultant traveling for professional purposes. She positioned the perfume atomizer inside her purse among ordinary cosmetics. The dermal patch was hidden inside a leather-bound notebook, indistinguishable from other contents. Nothing regarding her appearance or luggage would attract attention from security personnel or fellow passengers. Her arrival at Vienna's Westbahnhof station occurred at 7:15, where she purchased a second-class ticket to Salzburg and entered the departures hall. Khaled was already present, positioned near the platform entrance, checking his phone. He wore a gray suit and held a leather briefcase, resembling any other businessman traveling for work. Rachel maintained her distance, observing without approaching. She registered his body language, calm yet alert, periodically scanning the crowd as if anticipating something. His nature was cautious, even paranoid, though not cautious to a sufficient degree. The train's departure came at 7:45. Rachel boarded carriage 4, locating a seat in a partially occupied compartment. Khaled entered 2 minutes afterward, claiming a seat diagonally across the aisle. Other passengers settled in surrounding them. Students, retirees, business travelers absorbed in laptops and phones. The conductor verified tickets. The train lurched into movement, and Vienna's suburbs began scrolling past the windows. Throughout the initial hour, Rachel took no action. She opened her magazine, read several pages, occasionally directed her gaze out the window. She appeared entirely absorbed in train travel's mundane rhythms, just another passenger occupying time. However, beneath the calm exterior, her mind was processing contingencies, calculating timing, monitoring Khaled's movements and other passengers' positions. She required isolation, a moment when the compartment became less crowded and she could act without witnesses. The opportunity materialized at the first major stop, a small town where several passengers disembarked. The compartment emptied substantially, leaving only Rachel, Khaled, and an elderly woman dozing near the window. Khaled rose and walked toward the restroom at the carriage's rear. Rachel waited 30 seconds, then followed. The corridor stood empty. She moved quickly, reaching the restroom door just as Khaled emerged. She smiled apologetically, as though she'd been waiting for the facility, and stepped aside, permitting him to pass. As he moved past her, she stumbled slightly, reaching out to stabilize herself, her hand making brief contact with his forearm. The dermal patch transferred from her palm to his skin in a fraction of a second, so rapidly he didn't register the contact as anything unusual. He nodded politely and continued toward his seat. Rachel entered the restroom, secured the door, and removed the perfume atomizer from her purse. She dispersed a small quantity onto a tissue, generating a fine mist of the chemical compound. Then she returned to the compartment, resuming her seat and discreetly positioning the tissue on the armrest near where Khaled sat. The aerosol evaporated slowly, releasing microscopic droplets that Khaled would inhale across the next 30 minutes. The combination of dermal absorption and inhalation would guarantee maximum dosage, overwhelming his system more rapidly than either method alone. Khaled returned to his seat and opened a newspaper in Arabic. He read for several minutes, occasionally shifting position, adjusting his glasses. He displayed no immediate symptoms, which aligned with expectations. The chemical compounds needed time to circulate through his bloodstream and achieve critical concentrations. Rachel continued reading her magazine, monitoring him peripherally while preserving the appearance of complete disinterest. 20 minutes elapsed. The train crossed into rural Austria, passing through forests and small villages. Khaled began coughing lightly, a dry, persistent cough he attempted to suppress. He reached for a water bottle and drank, though the coughing persisted. His complexion began noticeably paling. He loosened his tie and wiped perspiration from his forehead with a handkerchief. Other passengers glanced at him with the mild concern people display for strangers appearing unwell, though no one took action. Khaled stood unsteadily, gripping the seat back for support. He moved toward the restroom again, walking with visible difficulty, one hand pressed against his chest. Rachel observed without expression. The elderly woman near the window looked up briefly, then returned to her dozing. The compartment's other passengers were absorbed in their own concerns, barely registering that something might be wrong. Inside the restroom, Khaled collapsed. The chemical compounds had achieved critical concentration in his bloodstream, triggering massive cardiac arrest. His heart's electrical rhythms destabilized. Contractions became erratic and ineffective. Blood pressure plummeted. He lost consciousness within seconds, his body slumping against the narrow walls of the compartment. There was no pain, no struggle, just a rapid cascading failure of cardiovascular function that medicine would subsequently describe as sudden cardiac death brought on by stress and unknown factors. The train continued for another 15 minutes before anyone noticed something was wrong. A passenger waiting to use the restroom knocked on the door repeatedly, receiving no response. He alerted the conductor, who employed a master key to open the door. They discovered Khaled slumped on the floor, unresponsive, his eyes fixed and dilated. The conductor immediately called for medical assistance, and the train made an emergency stop at the next station. Rachel remained in her seat as emergency personnel boarded. She watched paramedics attempt resuscitation, observed them eventually declare Khaled dead at the scene. Police arrived and began questioning passengers. When they reached her, she explained that she had been reading and hadn't noticed anything unusual until the commotion began. Her German was flawless, her demeanor calm yet appropriately concerned. The police took her contact information and moved on to other passengers. The train was held at the station for 3 hours while authorities processed the scene. Rachel remained throughout the investigation, maintaining her cover as Catherine Mueller, answering questions when asked, never volunteering information. When the train was finally cleared to continue, she rode the remaining distance to Salzburg, disembarked at the main station, and checked into a pre-arranged hotel. She spent the night there, maintaining the fiction of a business trip before taking a morning train back to Vienna. By the time she returned, Khaled's death was being reported in Austrian media as a tragic yet unremarkable incident. A Syrian businessman had died of an apparent heart attack while traveling by train. Authorities found no evidence of foul play. An autopsy would be performed, though initial examinations suggested natural causes. His body would be returned to Damascus for burial. Rachel remained in Vienna for another 2 weeks, continuing her routine as Simone Leclerc, monitoring news reports for any indication that authorities suspected assassination. None came. The autopsy report, when it was completed, listed cause of death as cardiac arrest due to acute myocardial infarction. Toxicology screening detected no known poisons. The chemical compounds Mossad had developed were specifically designed to break down rapidly in human tissue, becoming undetectable within hours of death. Even if forensic examiners had suspected foul play, they would have found nothing to prove it. In late September, Rachel received encrypted orders to extract from Vienna and return to Israel. She packed Simone Leclerc's belongings, cleaned the apartment, and flew to Paris using yet another identity. From Paris, she traveled to Rome, then Athens, and finally to Tel Aviv through a series of connecting flights that obscured her origin. The route was deliberately convoluted, designed to prevent anyone from tracing her movements back to Vienna. She arrived in Israel in early October 2010, exhausted and emotionally depleted after 3 years of continuous deep cover operations. She underwent extensive debriefing at Mossad headquarters, spending 2 weeks in isolation, while psychologists assessed her mental state and intelligence officers extracted every detail of the operation. She described the planning, the surveillance, the moment of execution, the extraction. Analysts reviewed her reports, examining the operation for lessons that could be applied to future missions. Officially, Rachel Tzur had completed a successful operation. Khaled Masri was dead, his financial networks disrupted, and Israeli involvement remained undetectable. She received commendations from senior Mossad leadership and was offered continued assignment to Caesarea. However, the psychological cost was becoming apparent. 3 years of living as other people had created fractures in her identity that would take years to repair, if they could be repaired at all. She declined further deep cover assignments, requesting transfer to analysis and training roles where she could contribute without the psychological burden of sustained deception. Mossad approved the request, recognizing that operatives who spent years in deep cover often reached a point where continuing was more dangerous than valuable. The human mind could only sustain so much fragmentation before the lines between real and performed self became irreversibly blurred. Rachel spent the next 5 years working as an instructor at Mossad's training facility, teaching new recruits the skills she had mastered. She lectured on identity construction, surveillance techniques, and the psychological challenges of deep cover operations. She was respected by colleagues, admired for her operational successes. However, colleagues also noted something absent in her demeanor: a distance, an emotional flatness that suggested parts of her remained locked in the identities she had abandoned. She married in 2013, a quiet ceremony attended only by family and a few close friends. Her husband was an architect with no connection to intelligence work. She told him about her service in general terms, acknowledging years spent working for Mossad, though never discussing specific operations. He knew better than to ask for details. The marriage lasted 4 years before dissolving quietly. Victims of the distance Rachel could never fully bridge, the parts of herself she could no longer access or share. The operation that killed Khaled Masri remained classified. No public acknowledgement was ever made, no memorial ceremonies conducted, no official records created beyond the encrypted files stored in Mossad's archives. To the world, he had died of natural causes on a train in Austria, one of thousands of people who die suddenly from cardiac events every year. Only a small number of intelligence professionals knew the truth, that his death had been carefully orchestrated by a state that had decided his elimination served its security interests. The broader impact of the operation took years to become apparent. Khaled's death disrupted Hamas financial networks in Europe temporarily, forcing reorganization and creating gaps that Israeli intelligence exploited for information gathering. However, new figures eventually rose to fill his role, establishing their own networks and methods. The cycle continued, each death creating temporary advantage, yet never achieving lasting resolution. Within Hamas, Khaled became a martyr, celebrated for his service to the resistance, and mourned as a victim of Israeli aggression. His photograph appeared in memorial ceremonies in Gaza and Damascus, framed alongside other leaders who had been assassinated over the decades. Speakers praised his dedication and vowed continued struggle. The narrative of martyrdom transformed his death into inspiration for new recruits, perpetuating the cycle he had been part of maintaining. For Rachel, the operation remained a defining moment that she could never fully process or integrate into her sense of self. She had killed a man efficiently and without hesitation, exactly as her training had prepared her to do. However, the act existed in a strange emotional vacuum, performed by Catherine Mueller or Simone Leclerc, identities that no longer existed yet through which Rachel had acted. The psychological compartmentalization that had allowed her to function during the operation made it difficult to connect the action to any coherent moral framework. Afterward, she left Mossad in 2016, taking early retirement and moving to a small coastal town south of Tel Aviv. She worked as a freelance translator, a job that required no deception, no false identities, no killing. She rebuilt a life defined by simplicity and solitude, avoiding the kinds of social entanglements that might require her to explain who she had been or what she had done. Friends from that period described her as pleasant yet remote, someone who never quite seemed fully present in conversations or relationships. The question that haunted her, the one she could never answer satisfactorily, was whether the operation had been necessary. Had Khaled Masri's death actually prevented violence, saved Israeli lives, advanced security objectives, or had it simply perpetuated a cycle where each assassination justified the next, where killing became routine policy rather than exceptional necessity? She had no way to know. The metrics of success in intelligence operations were always ambiguous, measured in events that didn't happen, threats that were disrupted yet never fully eliminated. The operation demonstrated something fundamental about modern intelligence warfare. With sufficient resources, planning, and willingness to sacrifice individual operatives to deep cover operations lasting years, a state could eliminate targets anywhere in the world. The method was not spectacular or dramatic. It was quiet, methodical, bureaucratic. Death arrived wearing a pleasant face and carrying a magazine, leaving behind only the illusion of natural order and questions that could never be satisfactorily answered. What makes operations like this possible is not advanced technology or James Bond gadgetry, though those elements certainly help. What makes them possible is the human capacity for sustained deception, the ability to live for years as someone else while waiting for a single moment to strike. Rachel had demonstrated that capacity at extraordinary cost, becoming so many people that the original self became just another performance in a repertoire of identities. The train still runs between Vienna and Salzburg. Passengers sit in carriage 4, unaware of what happened there. Commuters occupy the same seats where Khaled died and Rachel watched. The restroom has been cleaned 10,000 times since that September morning. Nothing marks the location of his death because that's how perfection looks in intelligence operations. Ordinary, unremarkable, leaving no trace that anything extraordinary ever occurred. For those who operate in this world, the lesson is clear. Anyone can be eliminated anywhere if the state possesses sufficient will and resources. No protection is absolute, no location truly safe. The machinery of assassination grinds forward continuously, bureaucratic and efficient, transforming killing into policy through documents signed in fluorescent-lit offices far from the places where people die. And somewhere in another European city, another operative is living under deep cover, cultivating relationships and gathering intelligence, waiting for orders that will transform them from observer to executioner. The next target is already marked, the authorization already signed, the operation already in motion. Because in the invisible war being fought across continents, the killing never stops. It just becomes invisible.